Push to talk, the light will turn on when the mic is on. Push to talk, the light will turn on when the mic is on. Push the talk button. The light will turn red when the mic is on.
The air conditioner is right. The vent has got to be like somewhere nearby. I feel like the vent. And my papers are getting.
Figure it out.
Chip.
You ready? The Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands will now come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the 4 bills before us today. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objection, so ordered. In addition, due to the broad interest in today's hearing, I would like to ask unanimous consent that all interested members be allowed to join us and participate on the dais. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Thank you all for attending today's Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands legislative hearing. I would like to extend my gratitude to the bill sponsors who are joining us to testify and to the witnesses, many of whom have traveled a long way to join us. We are here today to continue this subcommittee's work overseeing and enhancing the ongoing and future management of our national parks and public lands. Earlier this morning, the National Park Service announced that visitation to national parks exceeded 300 million for the 5th consecutive year. There were 327 million visits to national parks in 2019 alone. These impressive visitation numbers show that our national parks truly are the envy of the world, and our constituents expect Congress to invest in their future. Yes, that means addressing deferred maintenance, which is why we have been working with Ranking Member Bishop to find a path forward for the Restore Our Parks and Public Lands Act. But it also means promoting sustainability, allowing our parks and public lands to act as incubators for innovation and serve a role in addressing the climate crisis. Our parks can protect our shared past and help us prepare for the future. That's why I'm encouraged by today's hearing on bills to promote zero emissions, technology, reduce plastic waste, and increase access to green space in our park-poor urban communities. H.R. 3681, the Green Spaces, Green Vehicles Act, introduced by Committee Member Representative Mike Levin of California, will create a collaborative program between the Department of Energy, the National Park Service, and the U.S. Forest Service to promote the use of zero-emissions vehicles. Excuse me. The bill promotes the installation of charging station infrastructure on public lands and encourages land management agencies to modernize their own fleets to have more electric vehicles. Excuse me. The transportation sector is the largest contributor to U.S. GHG emissions. Excuse me. Thank you for your patience. The transportation sector is the largest contributor to U.S. GHG emissions, with light-duty vehicles accounting for 59% of transportation-related GHG emissions. If we're serious about confronting the climate crisis, we need to invest in emissions reduction technology. So I'm excited to hear more about Representative Levin's bill and the potential for public lands to help us meet that goal. Reducing plastic waste is another pillar of climate action this committee can support. Representative Mike Quigley's Reducing Waste in National Parks Act achieves this goal by codifying an Obama administration policy authorizing park superintendents to phase out the sale of disposable plastic water bottles after thorough evaluation and engagement with park partners, concessionaires, and the broader public. This was a successful policy that helped avoid between 1 to 2 million disposable plastic water bottles from being purchased, used, and discarded every year between 2011 and 2017. Unfortunately, it was overturned by the Trump administration with little study 2 weeks after Interior Secretary Bernhardt, a former lobbyist for the bottled water industry, was confirmed by the Senate for Deputy Secretary position. Representative Quigley and I learned about the importance of reducing plastic waste to our national parks when we visited Yellowstone last year, and now we have an opportunity to restore this program to limit pollution in our national parks. In addition to sustainable management of our national parks and public lands, we're also reviewing a bill to promote access to green space. Representative Nanette Barragan's Outdoors for All Act establishes guaranteed funding for the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Program, a competitive grant program to create and enhance parks and outdoor recreation areas in low-income and park-poor urban communities. Last, H.R. 3651, introduced by Representative Jeff Fortenberry of Nebraska, would alter the terms of a public purpose conveyance associated with the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail Interpretive Center. Congress authorizes conveyance to the Missouri River Basin Lewis and Clark Interpretive Trail and Visitor Center Foundation for outdoor recreation purposes. The foundation is now interested in leasing the parcel. I'm eager to learn more about the National Park Service's perspective on the proposed lease. With that, I will turn it over to the ranking member for his remarks and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Chair Holland for convening this hearing today about the 4 bills that deal with sustainability and recreation on our national's federal lands. As we begin the 2nd century of the existence of the National Park System, we should be mindful of the dual mission of the agency that it is charged with, both to conserve park resources and to ensure that they are left unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. I think it's fair to say that the National Park Service has sometimes struggled with this dual nature of its mandate. Each of these bills touches on an element of the National Park Service mission, and I'd like to comment briefly on each bill. H.R. 3651, offered by Congressman Jeff Fortenberry of Nebraska, would authorize the Missouri River Basin Lewis and Clark Interpretive Trail and Visitor Center Foundation to use up to 40 acres of non-developed land and underutilized land in Nebraska City for outdoor recreation. The land was previously conveyed to the foundation for the exclusive use of a historic site and interpretive center for the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail. This bill would allow the excess land to be used to meet the community's needs, such as providing a site for additional public land, public parks, and other public amenities. We will also be discussing H.R. 3681, offered by Congressman Levin of California. This bill directs the Department of Energy, the U.S. Forest Service, and National Park Service to collaborate on green spaces, green vehicles initiatives to facilitate the installation and use of zero-emission vehicles infrastructure on certain public lands. I appreciate the sponsor's interest in this area and share his dedication to being a good steward of our environment. Climate change is an important issue, and bipartisan conversations are necessary if we're going to make progress on impactful solutions, not just proposals that make us feel good. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on this topic. H.R. 4512, offered by Congressman Barragan of California, would establish a new mandatory appropriation for the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership by allocating 20% of land and water conservation fund revenues under the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act. While I commend the sponsor for her work to bring recreation areas lacking such opportunities, I have concerns that this bill may be duplicative of existing LWCF uses. In general, Congress should exercise extreme caution when establishing new mandatory spending. Mandatory appropriations put a program on financial autopilot and often result in ballooning and out-of-control spending when left unchecked. Finally, the subcommittee will consider H.R. 4236 offered by Congressman Quigley of Illinois. The bill would authorize each regional director of the National Park System to establish a program to recycle and reduce the use of disposable plastic bottles within each system unit located in the region. Regional directors would also be authorized to eliminate the sale of water in disposable plastic bottles within their units. This bill would legislatively reinstate former National Park Service Director Jonathan Jarvis's policy, which eventually led to 23 units banning the sale of bottled water. While I'm certainly supportive of working to reduce single-use plastic and litter on our public lands, I'm concerned that reinstating the bottled water sales ban is short-sighted and would create a dehydration risk for many visitors to our national parks. Before we consider this bill, I'd like to know if the previous ban resulted in any significant decrease in plastic waste in the parks, as both of the parks did not follow even the most minimum requirements to evaluate and monitor the sales ban's effects. Ironically, the 2011 ban did not ban the sale of other drinks in plastic bottles, such as soda or juices, and did not prohibit visitors from bringing in their own bottled water. We should not ignore the safety issues this bill could pose. We are experiencing record visitation in national parks in my district and many other parks across the country, many of which are in arid and remote areas. In the last few years, we've seen multiple deaths in our parks, including arches in my district, at least partially related to dehydration and heat sickness. We can and should encourage visitors to use reusable bottles and refill at available filling stations. However, we should not be making water potentially inaccessible to visitors. There are many important issues facing our national parks, including a $12 billion maintenance backlog. As somebody with 2 national parks in my district, I've seen firsthand the negative impact this has on visitors. I hope that we can keep the availability of recycling containers a part of that conversation to address any impact plastic water bottles could have on our parks, as opposed to a one-size-fits-all solution to banning bottles altogether. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today and look forward to hearing their testimony. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back. May I also ask for unanimous consent to submit this from the Council for Citizens Against Government Waste into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ranking Member Curtis. Now I would like to turn to our first panel and welcome the members of Congress who wish to testify in the bills they have sponsored. Under our committee rules, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but you may submit a longer statement for the record if you choose. The lights in front of you will turn yellow when there is 1 minute left and red when time is expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Quigley.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairwoman Holland, Ranking Member Curtis, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to address you this morning considering H.R. 4236, the Reducing Waste in National Parks Act, which would help address the serious problems of plastic waste from single-use plastic water bottles solely in America's most pristine natural places. According to the EPA, about 70% of plastic water bottles are not recycled and end up in landfills, lakes, streams, oceans, or just on the ground. In our parks, this means that single-use plastic bottles are collecting on trails in remote areas like the bottom of the Grand Canyon, degrading the environment and endangering wildlife. In the past, the National Park Service has been a visible leader on sustainability. In 2011, the NPS directed individual parks to increase their efforts to recycle and reduce waste, including banning the sale of single-use plastic water bottles where possible. The program was a smashing success, and parks that implemented the plan were able to produce real results. Zion National Park in Utah was able to eliminate the sale of over 60,000 plastic water bottles, or 5,000 pounds of waste, by stocking affordable, reusable water bottles in their concessions and installing reusable bottle filling stations to address hydration issues. Despite these successes, this program was rolled back. My bill would simply reinstate the program and give regional directors the authority to implement in a way that makes the most sense in their local context. This bill would not uniformly ban the sale of plastic water bottles in parks. There are park facilities without running water or in harsh environments that may require water be available. It also does not ban plastic bottles for soft drinks or other non-water beverages. It only covers single-use plastic water bottles. Plastic waste in concessions and near visitor centers is undoubtedly a problem, but is a separate problem that deserves a separate solution. This bill is a common-sense, nuanced approach to reduce the waste building up in our backcountry, wilderness, and trails of our national parks. Last September, I traveled to Yellowstone National Park with Chairwoman and a number of our congressional colleagues to learn more about the impacts of climate change on our parks. There, I purchased this bottle for about the same price as a plastic water bottle, but made of aluminum, which is much more easily recyclable. These bottles are great and showcase how easy it would be, and in fact was, for parks and the vendors that provide concessions in them to adapt to this new policy. While I do need to run to another hearing in the Appropriations Committee this morning, I look forward to fielding any questions you may have in writing, and I'm confident the witnesses here today can speak to the urgent need to reestablish this policy. On behalf of myself and the 26 other co-sponsors of this bill, thank you for your time and for holding this hearing today, and I'm hopeful that this bill can earn swift passage through this committee. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Quigley. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Badagon.
Thank you, Chairwoman Holland, Ranking Member, and the subcommittee for holding this hearing today on several bills, including the Outdoors for All Act, H.R. 4512, which I am proud to be the sponsor of. I also want to thank our lead co-sponsor on the Republican side, and we have several Republicans, Mike Turner, for his leadership and support on making this issue and continuing it to be a bipartisan issue. Finally, I want to thank Senator Kamala Harris, who's the lead sponsor of the Senate companion bill. The Outdoors for All Act would codify the existing National Park Service's Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership Program and create a dedicated source of funding for projects that expand outdoor recreational opportunities in urban and low-income communities. Parks can be hubs of economic and cultural activity, leveraging private investment to revitalize and reinvigorate urban communities. The Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership Program has provided $28.2 million in federal funds for over 50 projects, leveraging more than $60 million in funds from local and state governments, nonprofits, and private firms. This bill is personal to me on many levels. As the youngest of 11 kids, in a family that often struggled to make ends meet, I grew up in the shadow of heavy industrial facilities in the harbor area in South Los Angeles. I can tell you that escaping concrete and asphalt for the green grass of a city park and Little League practice meant the world to me. It was literally a breath of fresh air. Today, in that same neighborhood and others like it throughout our country, urban areas, underserved neighborhoods, and communities of color experience disproportionate levels of air and water pollution. They also have fewer green spaces to enjoy. A 2017 survey found that in Los Angeles County, 51% of residents live more than half a mile from a park, and the number of ball fields and playgrounds are well under the national average. This disparity is further exacerbated in communities of color. While the average amount of parkland in the county survey was 3.3 acres of parkland per 1,000 residents, the city of Compton, for example, in my district, reported only 0.6 acres of parkland per 1,000 residents. Compare that to the city of Malibu, which has 3 times the median household income of Compton and has 55.5 acres of parkland per 1,000 residents. This is nearly 100 times more parkland. This vast difference in access to open spaces highlights the importance of dedicated federal park funding for urban communities. Every kid, no matter where they live and what their income level is, deserves to play on grass and to explore the natural world. Access to the outdoors can ignite the enthusiasm of young people for their community and their environment. There is also a direct link to public health. Communities lacking parkland correlate with elevated rates of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. According to the Centers for Disease Control, creating or improving access to places for physical activity suggests a 25% increase in the proportion of the population who are physically active at least 3 times a week. We have seen the benefits of green spaces in my district. The Ricardo Lara Linear Park in Linwood added 12 acres of park space on vacant lots adjacent to the 105 freeway. The park has a community garden, a mile-long walkway, bioswales to filter runoff, and trees to shade and cool the neighborhood, which was really uncomfortable to walk in on hot days. Residents have expressed excitement over the space and have worked on organizing art walks and garden groups at the park. The wide range of community benefits the Outdoors for All Act can provide is demonstrated by over 65 organizations in support, including but not limited to the Sierra Club, the Wilderness Society, the City Parks Alliance, Green Latinos, Outdoor Afro, Vet Voice Foundation, and the Hispanic Access Foundation. With this bill, we have tremendous opportunity. We can partner with local governments to identify and create new green spaces. We can shrink the disparity in public parks to provide access to those at all income levels, and in doing so, we will create new opportunities for economic revitalization and healthier, more vibrant communities. I urge this subcommittee to support the Outdoors for All Act. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you so much, Ms. Barragan. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Levin.
Thank you, Chair Holland, for including my Green Spaces, Green Vehicles Act in today's hearing and for giving me the opportunity to discuss the bill. This bill would facilitate the adoption of zero-emission vehicles, known as ZEVs, by expanding charging infrastructure on public lands across our country and moving National Park Service and U.S. Forest Service fleets towards ZEV procurement. The climate crisis is the defining issue of our time. We can't avoid the effects of the changing climate. In fact, we're experiencing them already. But we still can avoid the worst impacts. However, in order to do so, we need to drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In 2017, the U.S. Energy Information Administration released data showing that the transportation sector had become the largest source of emissions in this country after the power sector had held that distinction for the previous 4 decades. Light-duty vehicles make up nearly 60% of transportation emissions. So in order to make significant progress in reducing U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, we've got to be serious about addressing vehicle emissions at every opportunity. I think that means reducing our dependence on the internal combustion engine and replacing it with newer, cleaner technologies like battery electric and fuel cell vehicles. For these ZEV technologies to be feasible, we need to develop a nationwide charging and fueling network that is accessible and easy for American drivers to use. I appreciate the work happening in other committees to make this network a reality. It's vital that we on the Natural Resources Committee ensure that Park Service and Forest Service lands are part of the network in order to increase the accessibility of public lands and reduce emissions associated with visitors. ZEV infrastructure is also critical for the future of our public lands because our national parks are warming at 2 times the average rate of the rest of the country and could experience a temperature increase of somewhere between 3 and 9 degrees Celsius by 2100. For these reasons, I introduced the Green Spaces, Green Vehicles Act. The bill would establish the Green Spaces, Green Vehicles Act initiative as a collaboration between the Park Service, Forest Service, and the Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. Under the initiative, the agencies would be authorized to form agreements with companies and nonprofits to secure electric charging and hydrogen fuel cell infrastructure for Park Service and Forest Service lands as well as adjacent lands. The initiative would also help the agencies acquire zero-emission vehicles and shuttle buses for their fleets, and it directs them to develop a strategy to ensure more than 25% of agency vehicles are zero-emitting by 2030. The bill provides annual funding for the initiative to be used for both vehicle and infrastructure acquisition and also requires the Park Service and Forest Service to provide information to the public on the availability of ZEV charging infrastructure. These actions will not only help combat the climate crisis, but also help to reduce criteria air pollutants that impact almost all our national parks. In fact, the National Parks Conservation Association, which is providing testimony on our next panel, last year found that 95% of national parks have significant air pollution problems. That's a stunning statistic. This includes 85% of parks that have air so polluted that it is at times unhealthy to breathe. And while there are many drivers behind these air quality issues, the Green Spaces, Green Vehicles Act can be an important part of the solution. Again, thank you to Chair Holland for holding today's hearing on this bill. I look forward to returning and asking questions of our witnesses. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Thank you. Is he here? Where? Okay. Welcome, Mr. Fortenberry.
Thank you, Chair Holland, for conducting this hearing. I really appreciate it. I wanted to also thank the ranking member, Young, but apparently he's not here. My good friend and colleague, Mr. Curtis, thank you for pinch hitting this morning. Really appreciate you holding this hearing on this important bill, the Lewis and Clark Visitor Center in my district. I live on the foot of the Great Plains. My district encompasses a lot of the Missouri River woodland bottom area, and Nebraska City rises as a footstool, if you will, on the step of the Great Plain. And right there was created the Lewis and Clark Visitor Center by this Congress a number of years ago. It is an outstanding resource and an impressive facility. The nonprofit organization associated with it is a committed group of individuals who have spent many years providing a meaningful educational experience for those who come and visit us. This particular legislative option would raise additional revenue to operate the center. So it is a truly unique place. It is the only visitor center and museum in the United States to focus on the flora and fauna and scientific discoveries recorded by the Lewis and Clark expedition. In 2008, the Visitor Center, through our efforts, was conveyed from the National Park Service to a nonprofit organization which is operating the site. So this bill would simply authorize the center to enter into a lease agreement for public outdoor recreation use on the 40 acres that surround the site. It would go a long way to ensuring the viability and sustainability of the center, again, to help it with its revenue sources. Madam Chair, I think you're very aware that we got hit by a bomb cyclone, a 500-year flood event last year, about a year ago. And while that predominantly affected areas to the north, including floodwaters covering a third of Offutt Air Force Base, which is also in my district, right south of Omaha, coming up to basically the foot of the Strategic Command headquarters, this Congress has done a very good job, and you and others have been very generous in helping us rebuild. The Lewis and Clark Center was also victimized by this indirectly in that the bridge there closed. Again, so the tough economic conditions that have hit it necessitate us to think differently and creatively as to how we help the nonprofit center continue to augment its revenues. So the Lewis and Clark expedition, if I may for a moment just give a little brief history, it was a watershed moment. More than 2 centuries later, the story of these outstanding explorers and the core of discovery continues to inspire Americans of all ages. And I do think that future Americans will continue to learn about how the core of discovery expanded our understanding of what lay beyond the East into the far reaches of the West. So I have a letter of support from the Executive Director to help you consider the possibility of augmenting this revenue source for them, and I would like to thank you for your support of the HR 3651.
Thank you, Mr. Fortenberry. Thank you very much. I thank the sponsoring members of Congress for their valuable testimony. I now invite panel 2 to take their places at the witness table. As with the first panel, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be part of the hearing record. The lights in front of you will turn yellow when there is 1 minute left, and they will turn red when time has expired. After the witnesses have testified, members will be given the opportunity to ask them questions. Thank you all for being here. The chair now recognizes Ms. Lena McDowell, Deputy Director of Management and Administration at the National Park Service.
Thank you. Chair Holland, Ranking Member Curtis, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to present the Department of the Interior's views on the 4 bills on today's agenda. I would like to submit our full statements for the record and summarize the department's views. H.R. 3651 would allow the foundation that runs the Missouri River Basin Lewis and Clark Visitor Center in Nebraska City to generate revenue by leasing 40 acres, about half the land that the National Park Service conveyed to the foundation for public recreation use, such as playing fields. The revenue would be used to help offset the maintenance and operating costs of the visitor center. The department supports H.R. 3651 as the bill would allow for continued operation of the visitor center without compromising visitor experience and without adding to the operations costs of the National Park Service. H.R. 3681 would require the Department of Energy, the National Park Service, and the U.S. Forest Service to collaborate on an initiative to facilitate the installation and use of zero-emission vehicle charging infrastructure in national parks and forests and nearby communities, and to purchase zero-emission fleet vehicles. The department appreciates efforts to enhance access to national parks and public lands and is currently working with partners to meet the needs of visitors who use electric vehicles. However, the department does not support H.R. 3681 as the National Park Service already has the authorities provided in this legislation and needs to utilize resources to reduce the Park Service's deferred maintenance backlog and address other critical infrastructure needs. Through partnerships with the Department of Energy, BMW, the California Energy Commission, and others, 150 electric vehicle charging stations have already been installed in or en route to national parks. The National Park Service also has a small but growing fleet of electric vehicles, totaling 74 at our last inventory. H.R. 4236 would require each National Park Service regional director to establish a program for recycling and reducing disposable plastic bottles within park units, including eliminating the sale of water and disposable plastic bottles in park units if several factors are considered. The department does not support enactment of H.R. 4236. This bill would establish in statute an approach similar to a policy that the National Park Service had in place from 2011 to 2017. That policy was rescinded in order to expand beverage choices for visitors. The elimination of sales of bottled water at some of our parks during that period removed the healthiest beverage choice while still allowing sales of bottled sweetened drinks. Parks continue to promote the recycling of disposable plastic water bottles, and many parks have worked with partners to provide free public water in bottle filling stations located in visitor centers and near trailheads. H.R. 4512 would enact in statute the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership Program, largely as it exists administratively, except that there would be significant changes in the way projects are funded and prioritized. The Outdoor Recreation Legacy Program is a nationwide competitive grant program that is a complementary program to the larger Land and Water Conservation Fund state and local assistance program, which provides formula-based grants to all U.S. states and territories. The department does not support H.R. 4512 because it is not consistent with the President's budget proposal, which calls for allocating all of the revenue the National Park Service receives from GOMESA to the LWCF state and local assistance program. This bill would redirect 20% of that revenue to the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Program. This would result in states and territories receiving a significantly reduced allocation compared to the amount that they would receive under the President's budget. In addition, the bill would codify priorities for projects, eliminating the flexibility to respond to changing outdoor recreation needs. It would also increase the number of jurisdictions eligible for the outdoor recreation grants from 486 to over 3,800 by including urban clusters in the definition of urban areas. This would increase duplication with the formula-based program. Chairman Holland, this concludes my statement. I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. McDowell. The chair now recognizes Ms. Allegra Happy Haynes, Executive Director of the City and County of Denver Department of Parks and Recreation. You have 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chair Holland, Ranking Member Curtis, and members of the subcommittee. I thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today in support of the Outdoors for All Act and share my story. I am Happy Haynes, a Denver native, fourth-generation Coloradan, and Executive Director of the City and County Denver Parks and Recreation Department. I am excited to support this critical legislation that will significantly improve close-to-home access to nature, making our cities healthier, safer, and more connected. I'd like to share a little of my own story with you. While I was growing up in Denver, by chance I came upon a small box canyon in a park that I frequently cut through to get to school. At first it was kind of scary and forbidding, especially since I was supposed to be walking on the sidewalk in plain view of the street. Eventually, I did venture into the little canyon, and soon it became my imaginary jungle with wild beasts and rivers and exotic plants far from the civilized world. I was constantly late for school and convinced that I was breaking some rule by exploring that space. That chance encounter is a big part of the reason why I am here speaking to you today. Although growing up, we could see the majestic Rocky Mountains looming over downtown Denver from my community, they might as well have been on the moon. They were so disconnected from our lives. During my senior year in high school, I had a rare chance to participate in a special experiential education program for a handful of students that took us to the canyons of Mexico, the Navajo Reservation, and rafting on the Yampa River. It was these rare and random experiences that led me to fall in love with nature and outdoor adventure. I should not still be such a rare bird, an African-American woman, urban dweller, and outdoor recreation enthusiast. In Denver and other cities, we are on a mission to make sure that your race, income, and zip code don't affect your access to nature, and to ensure that stories and experiences like mine are neither rare nor by chance. The Outdoors for All Act would greatly help with this mission. While the Land and Water Conservation Fund is an important conservation tool, LWCF grants often don't trickle down to cities, which is why the ORLP program is so vital. To ensure that cities can rely on the ORLP, there needs to be mandatory funding, as would be enacted by this bill. Since 2014, the National Park Service has awarded ORLP grants to 49 communities and 29 states that will expand outdoor recreation. Thanks to the ORLP, my department has begun the important work of expanding access to nearby nature, particularly in underserved communities. Historic disinvestment has left many low-income communities and communities of color without access to quality parks and recreation opportunities, and with park assets in need of significant upgrades. Cities struggle with the strain of high healthcare costs due to obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. Research tells us that having parks in our neighborhoods near where residents live provides immense health benefits. One of Denver's newest jewels is the Montbello Open Space Park, one of the first ever ORLP grant recipients in 2015. This project leveraged other local and private dollars to build a 5-acre park in a historically underserved community, improving park access for 3,700 people within a 10-minute walk. This park is being restored to native shortgrass prairie with trails, artwork, an outdoor classroom, and nature play experiences, along with a custom rock climbing boulder that local students helped design. The edge of the Rocky Mountain Arsenal National Wildlife Refuge is immediately adjacent to this neighborhood, but because of its size and lack of nearby entrances, it remains largely inaccessible to this low-income community right next door. We hope the Montbello Open Space will help draw this community towards its neighboring wildlife refuge and other beautiful areas of our state. In my written testimony, you will find a story about Chris Urias, whose life has been transformed because of his experience with environmental learning for kids and this park. In addition to the health benefits, local parks provide climate-resilient spaces and spur economic growth by creating jobs and making metropolitan areas more competitive in today's global economy. The ORLP is the only federal program focused exclusively on supporting parks and outdoor recreation opportunities in cities where 80% of Americans live. Local communities like ours cannot do it alone. Access to nature is a human right. Congress should seize this moment and pass the Outdoors for All Act. I thank you and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Haynes. The chair now recognizes Ms. Cosgrove, Lauren Cosgrove, Senior Program Manager for the Northeast Region at the National Parks Conservation Association.
Chair Holland, Congressman Curtis, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here today to testify on the Green Spaces Green Vehicles Initiative. I'm Lauren Cosgrove. I'm a Senior Program Manager for the Northeast Region of the National Parks Conservation Association. Founded in 1919, NPCA is the leading national independent voice for protecting and enhancing America's national park system for present and future generations. And we appreciate the opportunity to provide our views regarding H.R. 3681, the Green Spaces Green Vehicles Act, sponsored by Congressman Levin. This legislation is critical for facilitating the installation of zero-emission vehicle infrastructure on National Forest System land, National Park System land, and current related lands. We appreciate the subcommittee's attention to this important bill. NPCA recognizes that climate change is perhaps the greatest threat national parks have ever faced. And as the leading advocate for our national parks, we work tirelessly with Congress and federal land managers by supporting and promoting efforts to reduce climate emissions and air pollution both on Capitol Hill and in the field. We are alarmed by the destructive impacts already underway on our national parks, from storm surges that are eroding our coastline and threatening cultural resources, to the melting glaciers and compromised wildlife habitat. But this bill is one small but important way that Congress can ensure our national parks, national forests, and public lands management agencies are utilizing responsible and sustainable operations to protect the places that America treasures the most. According to the Park Service's Green Parks Plan that was published in 2016, 30% of annual greenhouse gas emissions from Park Service operations come from transportation. In this plan, the Park Service set goals to transform their fleet to a new generation of fuel-efficient, low greenhouse gas emitting vehicles. But this work is extremely difficult without supplemental funding, traffic studies, and partnerships. Given the staffing constraints and funding shortfalls that the Park Service faces, NPCA recognizes that the agency cannot achieve these goals on their own. The establishment of the Green Spaces, Green Vehicles Initiative would allow the Secretary of the Interior to enter into agreements with the public, private, and nonprofit entities for the acquisition of zero-emission vehicles, the installation of charging and fueling infrastructure, and operation of such infrastructure. It's imperative that the Park Service be able to work in partnership with the private and nonprofit sectors to institute this program. H.R. 3681 also considers appropriate locations for new zero-emission vehicle infrastructure. By working with Park Service staff and transportation experts, such as the Denver Service Center and the Volpe Center and others, federal land managers can determine strategic locations for new infrastructure that complements existing hub-and-spoke transit systems in parks based on current traffic patterns and future market demand. As new zero-emission vehicle infrastructure is proposed in and around national parks, NPCA recommends a thorough and transparent process that includes opportunities for public feedback on appropriate use and location of such infrastructure to ensure that any future development does not compromise the integrity of park resources and the visiting experience. If passed, H.R. 3681 would authorize $50 million each fiscal year to be appropriated to purchase the zero-emission vehicles, acquire, install, and operate the zero-emission vehicle infrastructure in parks, national forests, and other public lands. NPCA appreciates this additional investment to initiate the program, and we encourage members to ensure this initiative is funded annually in the proper appropriations bills. We understand firsthand how crippling funding cuts are to the health and operation of our America's national parks, and an appropriation of $50 million is crucial for the success of this program. In conclusion, NPCA and our many partners concerned with the future sustainability of America's national parks are grateful to the subcommittee for prioritizing zero-emission vehicle infrastructure by taking up this important bill. This is one critical way that America's public land agencies can set an example for the rest of American people and the future of our nation's clean energy economy. Thank you for the opportunity to testify and the consideration of our views.
Thank you, Ms. Cosgrove. The chair now recognizes Mr. Joseph Doss, President of the International Bottled Water Association. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairwoman Holland, Ranking Member Curtis, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Joe Doss, and I am President and CEO of the International Bottled Water Association. I appreciate this opportunity to provide you with our thoughts on H.R. 4236. IBWA and its members support recycling and waste reduction programs in national parks and in communities throughout the United States. However, we oppose efforts to ban the sale of bottled water in national parks or any other places. Bottled water is a safe, healthy, and convenient product, and it has the smallest environmental footprint of any packaged beverage. Given the critical importance of proper hydration and the increase in obesity and diabetes rates in the United States, Any efforts to discourage or prevent park visitors from drinking bottled water are not in the public interest. There are hundreds of beverage products that are packaged in plastic containers, but this legislation unreasonably targets only bottled water. It would allow the removal of the healthiest packaged beverage from national parks, yet continue to permit less healthy sugar-sweetened beverages, which are packaged in much heavier containers, to be sold. Those other beverage containers must be heavier to keep in the carbonation in the bottle or in the processes that are used to make the product. IBWA thinks it is important for people to have the ability to drink water of all types, tap, filtered, and bottled. We therefore support efforts to have water refilling stations in national parks and to encourage park visitors to use refillable containers. However, banning the sale of bottled water will cause an increase in the sale of sugar-sweetened beverages, which will actually increase the amount of plastic waste in parks due to their heavier packaging. According to a recent Harris Poll survey conducted for IBWA, 91% of the respondents said that bottled water should be available wherever other drinks are sold. If bottled water is not available, 74% of people said they would choose another packaged drink, not water from a drinking fountain, not filtered tap water, and not unfiltered tap water. As previously mentioned, these other packaged drinks would likely be less healthy and would increase the amount of waste in national parks. This legislation seeks to codify a failed National Park Service policy that was issued in December 2011. When the policy was first announced during the previous administration, the NPS director noted that, quote, banning the sale of water bottles in national parks has great symbolism, but runs counter to our healthy food initiative as it eliminates the healthiest choice for bottled drinks, leaving sugary drinks as a primary alternative. A ban could pose challenges for diabetics and others with health issues who come to a park expecting bottled water to be readily available, end quote. NPS also stated that a ban could affect visitor safety. Proper hydration is key to planning a safe 2-hour hike or a multi-day backcountry excursion. Even reasonably priced reusable water bottles may be out of reach for some visitors, especially those with large families, end quote. Now, despite acknowledging these flaws, the National Park Service went forward with the bottled water sales ban policy. It is our understanding that 23 national parks subsequently banned the sale of bottled water. This was done without any meaningful analysis of the various factors that were required to be considered in order to oppose a ban and without the monitoring and evaluation mandated by the policy. Health, nutrition, and consumer groups also expressed concerns about the NPS bottled water sales ban policy. The Center for the Science in the Public Interest noted that, quote, a policy that allows bottled sugar water, parentheses, soda, and parentheses, but not healthy bottled water to be sold at our national parks does not make sense, end quote. The Public Health Advocates Organization stated, quote, from a public health perspective, a National Park Service policy giving unhealthy sugary drinks preferred treatment over water is nothing short of ludicrous, end quote. In August 2017, the National Park Service wisely rescinded the bottled water sales ban policy. NPS noted that the ban, quote, removed the healthiest beverage choice at a variety of parks while still allowing sales of bottled sweetened drinks, end quote. NPS also stated that while they will continue to encourage the use of free water bottle filling stations as appropriate, ultimately it should be up to our visitors to decide how best to keep themselves and their families hydrated during a visit to a national park, particularly during hot summer visitation periods. We wholly agree. There should be widespread agreement that improving recycling and waste management efforts for all food and beverage products, regardless of whether they're purchased inside or outside the parks, makes sense. IBWA would welcome the opportunity to work with the sponsor of this legislation to determine the best path forward to ensure that America's national parks are preserved for generations to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Doss. The chair now recognizes Ms. Jenny Romer, Legal Associate for the Surfrider Foundation's Plastic Pollution Initiative.
Good morning. I would like to thank the chair and ranking member and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify on this bill. I'm a legal associate with the Surfrider Foundation's Plastic Pollution Initiative. The Surfrider Foundation is dedicated to the protection and enjoyment of our ocean, waves, and beaches. Founded in 1984, the Surfrider Foundation has been advocating for plastic pollution reduction laws for over a decade. through our grassroots Rise Above Plastics campaign and Plastic Pollution Initiative. Plastic pollution on our beaches and in our parks overwhelmingly comes from products that we use for just a few minutes, are discarded into the environment, and then persist on our streets, trails, waterways, and ocean for a lifetime. We advocate at the local, state, and federal level for policies aimed at reducing single-use plastic and encouraging a switch to reusables. I am here today in support of the Reducing Waste in National Parks Act. Much like the Obama-era guidelines, the bill would require National Park Service regional directors to work with park superintendents to develop a program for recycling and reducing the use of single-use plastic water bottles for each unit of the national park system. Americans consume nearly 14 billion gallons of bottled water in 2018. This bill presents a cautious and sensible step to reduce this staggering number. There are four main reasons why the Surfrider Foundation supports this bill. First, these bottles are made from plastic. It's no secret that plastic pollution is a problem. In 2015, over 400 million metric tons of plastic was produced worldwide. An estimated 8 million metric tons of plastic is going into the ocean every year. Second, this policy would address single-use plastic water bottle litter in national parks. Single-use plastic beverage bottles and caps are consistently one of the top 10 items collected at litter cleanups. Litter of single-use water bottles on trails, not soda bottles, was noted as a particular problem this policy sought to address. Third, we are beginning to hear more and more about bottled water as an extractive industry, as water rights for bottled water become increasingly disputed. More than half of the bottled water sold in the United States comes from municipal tap water. Bottled water comes from some of the most drought-ridden places in the country, including California. Fourth, bottled water generates avoidable greenhouse gas emissions throughout the process. From extraction of oil, to manufacturing, to transportation, to disposal, each of these steps generates emissions. In the bottled water sector, one of the biggest costs is transportation. Bottles are often trucked over 1,000 miles. Even when a bottle is recycled, there are emissions from manufacture and transport. All of these environmental harms are avoidable by drinking clean and safe tap water where available and using reusable bottles. There are many reasons to believe that this bill will be successful, not the least of which is that we have implementation data from 23 parks that participated in the program. A 2017 National Park Service report found that this policy prevented at least 1.3 million single-use plastic water bottles from being purchased, used, and discarded every year. This bill merely requires regional directors to consider the elimination of the sale of single-use water bottles. Regional directors must go through a very specific analysis before moving forward with a ban, including the amount of waste that could be eliminated, infrastructure costs and funding sources for bottle refill stations, cost and availability of BPA-free reusable containers, input from concessionaires, and the availability to provide visitor education at the park and online, including the feasibility of posting signs so that visitors can easily find refill stations. The Grand Canyon is one example of a national park that implemented this policy, and that park saw a decrease in the amount of plastics going to landfill, as well as an increase in the volume of plastic being recycled. The park saw decreases in litter associated with single-use plastic water bottles, both along the inner canyon and rim trails, as well as below the rim. This litter was what the policy sought to address. Our national parks stand as symbols of sustainability, conservation, and environmental education for the millions of park goers that visit them annually. In order to preserve these lands and these values for generations to come, national parks across the country should phase out single-use water bottles. Thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Romer. Thank you to all of you for your valuable testimony. The chair will now recognize members for questions, and under Committee Rule 3D, each member will be recognized for 5 minutes. And I would like to recognize Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair Holland and Ranking Member Young, and thank you to all of the witnesses. Every child in this country, regardless of where they live, deserves access to the outdoors and green space. But the reality is that far too many in low-income communities, including those in the district I represent in the Chicagoland area, lack access to the nearby green spaces. This is environmental injustice. Green spaces are crucial for the health and well-being of kids and should not be reserved solely to those with means. Just this morning, Chair Grijalva and my colleague, Representative McEachin and Representative Lowenthal, announced the introduction of Environmental Justice for All Act, of which I am a proud original co-sponsor. This bill includes the provisions outlined in H.R. 4512, which we're considering here today, and would ensure environmental justice for underserved communities across the nation. Ms. Haynes, thank you for being here today. In your testimony, you briefly mentioned that how historic disinvestments have led to the lack of park and recreational access that many underserved communities face today. Can you briefly explain how the Outdoors for All Act will help close this park equity gap?
Thank you, Congressman Garcia. Yes, I'd be glad to answer that question. The Outdoor Recreation Legacy Program really helps to catalyze investments in areas of our city that have been underinvested. And by underinvested, in many instances, that means underdeveloped. So we have wonderful parks in Denver, in our beautiful areas of the town, generally more affluent areas, and many of our lower income communities were built without these major park assets. When we look at the disparate health impacts in those communities, we know that adding green space and parks and trails is vital to improving health and the economic well-being of those communities. This program is a competitive grant program, so it helps make sure that we're stepping up our game, that we're being more innovative. And in communities that are already developed, finding open space is a real challenge. And so these additional dollars really help cities that struggle to build new facilities and to expand facilities in our underserved communities.
Thank you so much. Ms. McDowell, in your testimony, you note that adopting H.R. 4512 would mean significantly less funding for local recreation projects throughout the country. But funds provided in H.R. 4512 would in fact go to local recreation projects as written in the text of the bill. On the other hand, the president's budget actually eviscerates the Land and Water Conservation Fund by nearly 97%. These funds are critical for states and local government to create much-needed green spaces in our communities. Can you walk us through and elaborate on how the president's proposed cuts to the Land and Water Conservation Fund would impact local recreation projects throughout the country?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. I don't have exact details on how it would impact specific projects. I can say that the Park Service and the department continue to view these funds as a priority and providing funds to local communities as important for accomplishing our mission.
Too bad you don't have that information. So your agency argues against this bill for the impacts to local recreation projects, yet it simultaneously advocates for completely gutting the primary fund for local communities to carry out these projects. That sounds hypocritical. Each year, money is diverted from LWCF, leaving communities with fewer resources to make investments in outdoor recreation and conservation. My neighborhood, where I have lived for the past 50 years, in Little Village in Chicago, one of the youngest communities in Chicago, opened a new park in 2014, the first in over 75 years in the area. Our communities should not have to wait decades for green spaces. I thank all of the witnesses and the chair for the opportunity. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. The chair recognizes Ranking Member Curtis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd like to begin my questioning by just acknowledging that all of us are so dependent on these national parks, protecting them and preserving them, and appreciate everybody coming here in that spirit today. Ms. Romer, you highlighted the Grand Canyon National Park success in decreasing litter associated with single-use water bottles. And in your written testimony, I noted that you footnoted the documentation for that was actually a pre-ban estimate. Do we have any good data after the ban, any good scientific data about the reduction of the water bottles?
National Park, and and aside from the National Park report later, that was also footnoted in my testimony.
Good. We'll ask.
Included data specific to several parks as far as.
I'll ask the Deputy Director about that in a second. Perhaps you can sense a little bit of the frustration about not having good data and using estimates to claim the reduction. Deputy Director McDowell, as you've heard, advocates of this policy recite the reduction. The National Park Service did do a study in 2016. Are you aware of any data in that study that documented the reduction of the water bottles?
I'm aware of a 2017 study. There were some concerns from the Park Service in that report about the data used. The water filling station usage information was partially estimated, and there were some concerns about the statistical extrapolation of the environmental benefits.
And I don't mean to imply that, I guess we all need to acknowledge just the collection of this data is very difficult, right? We don't know who's carrying in bottles. We don't know if they refilled. Does that mean that they bought a bottle and refilled it? So I get it, that this is hard to collect. I think one of my concerns, too, I mentioned in my open remarks, Deputy Director, is the overall safety issues. I've got some data in front of me about the backlog, and I noticed that the fourth largest category in backlog is water systems and providing water. Do you agree and acknowledge that providing drinking water to the visitors of these parks is absolutely essential, and sometimes we have weaknesses in infrastructure to be able to do that?
Certainly, we are making sure that our water systems are providing potable water for our visitors, but yes, water infrastructure is an issue in many of our parks.
I'd like to support for the record these, it just happened to pick 7 parks, 5 of which are in my state, that talk about this deferred maintenance and the problem with water.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Doss, you're, if not careful, you're the bad guy here.
Pardon me?
If not careful, your industry's kind of the bad guy here, and I'd like to talk about that just a little bit. You know, the irony is the single-use nature of your water bottles makes them very thin, and that I try to use them multiple times, and sometimes they're not. Is the industry looking at all at the thickness of this and realizing that actually a thicker water bottle may actually be reused more often and usable?
Well, certainly we have the lowest environmental impact of any packaged beverage. As you noted, and as anybody who's touched a bottle of water lately notices, that we have done a great deal to lightweight our products. First of all, let me just point out that all bottled water products, including their caps, are 100% recyclable. And we have taken steps to make sure that our bottles are as light as they possibly can be. As a matter of fact, we've taken a look at our bottles compared to any other packaged beverages, and right now we are at probably 9.25 grams for a bottled water bottle, and probably 23.4 grams is what you would need for a soft drink bottle. As I mentioned before, you have to have the larger, heavier plastic because of the carbonation, it would fizz out. That alone, in the period of 2000 to 2014, saved 6.2 billion pounds of PET resin.
I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to jump in on
Yes,
you
sir.
here
Thank you.
and just acknowledge that. I regret that we've spent so much of our time on the banning side of this discussion, and we really should be spending a lot of time on the recycling side as well. And do we have adequate facilities and encouragement and signage to get people recycling. And Madam Chair, as I close, I'd just like to ask for permission to submit one more document. It's the FOIA request response from DOA in 2016 acknowledging that there wasn't the data available to conduct a post-ban analysis. Thank you.
Without objection. Thank you, Ranking Member Curtis. The chair recognizes Mr. Lowenthal.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Curtis, for holding this hearing. And first, I want to thank Ms. Romer and the Surfrider for all your great work in protecting our oceans and our beaches. But I want to point out, and I think you already have, but I want to reaffirm, that the plastic waste crisis is not just a coastal issue. Plastic breaks down into microplastics that are found in rainwater on the peaks of the Rocky Mountains, in farmland soil that is used to produce our food, and in our lakes and in our rivers. It's because plastic waste has reached such a crisis level that Senator Udall and I introduced just 2 weeks ago the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. It's a comprehensive bill that incorporates best practices such as extended producer liability, national bottle deposit, and minimums recycled content standards, shifting the cost and the burden the cost burden and the responsibility for recycling and the cleanup of to the producers instead of municipalities and also with a bottle deposit will create incentives for better product design if they are responsible themselves. Representative Quigley's Reducing Waste in National Parks Act is another common sense approach to ensuring that our national parks continue to be a best practice when it comes to preservation and environmental protection. Ms. Romer, can you tell us more about how the Reducing Waste in National Parks Act will not only help our national parks best manage plastic waste, which I think you've already indicated, but how is this bill going to have benefits outside of the boundaries of national parks?
Well, this bill really encourages reuse rather than single-use water bottles, the reuse and refill of reusable water bottles. And bottled water costs about 2,000 times more than tap water. And having this policy in place in national parks where park visitors are encouraged to purchase reusable water bottles and refill them is really creates kind of a gateway to using those bottles outside of the park and to other behaviors that step away from single use and towards reusable products like bags and cups and other things like that. So it's very important to start in the park.
Thank you. Mr. Das, can you give us some data or share with us the actual percentage of plastic bottles, water bottles, that are actually reused? In our understanding, while we do have recycling programs out there and they're very worthy, that very, very small percentage is actually recycled, that's collected. Over 90% is either incinerated, it either goes to landfills, and until recently it was shipped to developing countries. How much of these bottles that you talked about actually go into the recycling of new bottles?
Right now.
And do you have data to indicate to us?
We do, and this is data that I can share in more detail with the committee and with the congressman, but approximately 30% of bottled water containers now are recycled, and we certainly know we can do better than that.
So that's just recycled. So 70% are not recycled, 30% are actually in the process. And those in the process, how many actually end up being in the next generation of bottles?
Well, we're hoping to get all of that back, but unfortunately, because of some issues like contamination and other things that happen down the recycle chain, not all of the bottles are able to be recycled, but that's something we're trying to make.
Is it not true that you can purchase virgin gas for, it's cheaper than to use recycled bottles for new bottles?
At this point, I think it is. It depends
That's
on the
right.
price
So
of
we
the
have
bill.
an economic issues that are leading not to the recycling, and because it's just cheaper for developers and producers to use virgin gas.
The key is to get it back, and we're doing all that we can to try to get our bottles back. We're working with groups like Keep America Beautiful, the Recycling Partnership, and it's very important for us to get back quality, food-grade material so that it can be used in bottles. Again, we like the bottle-to-bottle exchange with recycling, but it's important that we get back good, non-contaminated, recycled material.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal. I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. I have some questions about the Mr. Levin's bill, but I wanted just to say that Mr. Fortenberry was in here talking about the Lewis and Clark expedition, and gosh, they survived all that time without disposable water bottles. They were able to find the water to drink on their expedition. And so I just feel like Americans and people around this world have gotten lazy about doing what we need to do to keep ourselves healthy. I have this water bottle that I've been using for quite a while. I've been taking my own refillable bottle for probably over 10 years. I don't use any one-use anything for my drinks. So I try real hard to always have a coffee cup that I can refill. And I bring my own silverware to work every single day so I don't have to use plastic forks and spoons and things like that. Because I should be inconvenienced a little bit when it comes to the planet. And I am, I just get a little irritated when people say, oh, it's so inconvenient that these people don't have a plastic water bottle to buy, bottled water. And thank you for telling me that I'm saving 3,000 times every time I refill this for free. And actually, this bottle was free also because I went on a tour of the Netflix studios in my district, and they gave me that. So it's a win-win situation for me. But I just, I don't buy this, people will dehydrate themselves if they don't, take care of yourself. Be inconvenienced. Carry a bottle around and carry a cup around and do what we need to do to save our planet, because it's ridiculous that there are 8 million pounds of plastic going into the ocean every single year. That's unacceptable. And look, animals, they don't have a choice. The animals in the ocean, they don't have a choice. We are the ones that are putting that on them. And we are the ones that need to stop it. So I think along with us doing what we need to do to cut this horrible scourge of plastic out of our lives, that we need some public service announcements to tell people that it's up to you. It's up to you to take care of yourself and stay hydrated, and that means taking your own bottle or doing whatever you have to do. So thank you for letting me just say that. I have, since no one has talked about this, or maybe they have, I wanted to ask Ms. Cosgrove, with respect to the HR 3681, thank you so much for being here. When I was visiting Yosemite National Park last year, I got a firsthand look at the impacts that the unprecedented surge in park visitation has these protected landscapes in our environment as I sat in bumper-to-bumper traffic for 2 hours from the start of the park to our hotel. And I could have kicked myself for not pulling over at the first parking lot I saw and taking the shuttle bus and then going back and getting the car later on, because that was 2 hours I could have been hiking or doing something else in that beautiful space. Ms. Cosgrove, in your opinion, would you say that national park units are threatened or degraded by air pollution?
Thank you for that question, Chair. Yes, I would definitely say that air pollution is unfortunately one of NPCA's greatest concerns facing our national parks. As Congressman Levin mentioned in his remarks, NPCA recently produced a report where we used EPA and National Park Service data, and we found that 96% of all national parks are suffering from problems associated with air pollution. This is impacting our visibility in parks. It's also impacting the health of not only the communities that live outside of parks, but it's impacting the health of the visitors and of the wildlife that live within these parks. And as has been recognized many times this morning, vehicles and transportation is the largest contributing sector to our greenhouse gas emissions in this country. So that's, again, why I would like to emphasize how important this bill is, because it's addressing Park Service operations and visitor services that can rely on clean emission vehicles and infrastructure that we need to see in our parks.
Thank you, Ms. Cosgrove. The chair recognizes Mr. Levin.
Thank you, Chair Holland. Before I turn to my questions, I ask unanimous consent that this letter of support for the Green Spaces, Green Vehicles Act from the Center for Transportation and the Environment is entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Ms. Cosgrove, I appreciate the testimony that you provided today, and in that testimony, you recommend that the bill dedicate a certain percentage of authorized funds to facilitate the transportation of large numbers of guests to frequently visited sites. Can you expand on the need for this sort of funding and provide more detail on how you envision it being used?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you again for this question. I think it points to some of the issues that the chair was just mentioning in terms of traffic in Yosemite. I know from the Northeast, we're also seeing these impacts up at Acadia, and some of our most popular national parks are struggling with congestion, particularly on the roads from visitors using single passenger vehicles. And so I think that this bill provides a great opportunity with the additional $50 million that is authorized and hopefully appropriated to provide access to alternative methods of getting around these parks, utilizing electric shuttles, potentially ferries, trolleys, and others that will transport large numbers of visitors to some of the most popular sites in our parks. I also want to emphasize the importance of that $50 million authorization. I can, again, reference from the Northeast. There's some shuttle buses that have no longer been running, particularly the Roosevelt Ride, as it's known, that brings people from the Poughkeepsie train station to FDR's home, Valkill, and the Vanderbilt Mansion. These are really important historic sites, and it provides visitors an opportunity to see them without getting in their personal vehicle. So I would hope that the bill prioritizes group transport as much as possible.
Thank you for that. In your testimony, you also highlighted that the bill supports the goals set out by the National Park Service's 2016 Green Parks Plan. What goals does the Green Parks Plan include related to Park Service fleets and greenhouse gas emissions, and is the Park Service meeting its goals related to transportation emissions?
Thank you. That's a very great question. Unfortunately, I don't have the latest stats and progress report on where we are meeting those goals, but I do know that the goals were very important, and including strategies to reduce vehicle miles traveled within parks and taking single passenger cars off the road. Again, where I can't point to the progress reports on that, I am aware that those goals were supported by the previous administration's executive order that required the Park Service to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agency fleets by 30% and to hit that marker by 2025 compared to the 2014 baseline. Now, unfortunately, that executive order was reversed by the current administration in February of 2018. And so I, too, would be very curious to know the progress on those goals. And again, I think it points to the importance of this bill to try to move us along and achieve those goals originally set.
Thank you, Ms. Cosgrove. Ms. McDowell, I'd like to turn to you. Thank you for being with us. And if you could please just answer two questions with a yes or a no, I'd be grateful. First, is it true that the President's budget request seeks to cut National Park Service funding by $587 million? Again, just yes or no.
I actually don't know the exact number.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
We think it's true, but if you can verify for us, we'd appreciate
I can
it.
certainly get back to you on that one.
Thank you. Second, is it true that the budget request includes a cut to construction funding which is used to address things like the maintenance backlog.
I do not have the specifics on which parts of the construction budget.
All right, for sake of argument, we think that that's true as well. You'll have to take my word for it, but we look forward to your following up and verifying that. So on the one hand, it's disappointing that the maintenance backlog is being used as an excuse to oppose this legislation, while at the same time, the President's budget requests that Congress cut accounts to use the backlog. That is a little bit frustrating. However, I was pleased that your testimony recognizes the value of ZEB infrastructure since the Park Service has started to install charging stations, which is positive. Our bill would build on the agency's start and provide it with more resources to do what they're doing already and to help accomplish its goals. So I think we should be increasing our investments in innovation and new technologies, not making excuses for being stuck in the past. I am out of time, but I'm grateful for the support that we've seen for this legislation. I look forward to working with all interested stakeholders to getting it across the finish line, and I'm very grateful to both the chair and the ranking member for their working with us and for having today's hearing. Thank you, and I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be open for 10 business days for these responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.